Good evening and welcome to P&P Live. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of Politics and Prose, along with my wife, Lissa Muscatine. And thanks for joining us here online, where we've been able to move many of our events in response to the current pandemic and continued need for physical distancing. With Crowdcast, which is the platform we're using this evening, you can see us, but we can't see you. And you can still ask a question. To do so, just click on the Ask a Question icon at the bottom of the screen. And there you'll also see a green button to purchase this evening's featured book, Dark Mirror by Bart Gellman. It's a real pleasure to be hosting Bart, whom I got to know and marvel at when we overlapped at the Washington Post. Bart reported for the Post for 21 years through the 1990s and 2000s, serving tours as a legal, military, diplomatic, foreign, and special projects correspondent, and gaining a reputation as one of the most enterprising, dogged, and resourceful journalists on the staff. After writing a Pulitzer-winning series about Dick Cheney's vice presidency, followed by a best-selling book, Angler, on the same subject, Bart left the Post in 2010, but returned 3 years later with a trove of intelligence documents leaked by Edward Snowden. Based on those documents, Bart anchored a team of Post reporters who wrote a Pulitzer-winning series that exposed widespread secret surveillance by the National Security Agency. His new book, Dark Mirror, recounts his own story, engaging with Snowden and exploring the full nature and impact of a government surveillance system that expanded after the 9/11 attacks and sought to collect vast amounts of data on people in great secrecy and without previous constraints. Early reviews of the book have been very positive, calling it illuminating, engrossing, thorough, and balanced, a revealing narrative that not only examines intelligence gathering and government overreach in the digital age, but provides a thrilling account of investigative journalism in a time of pervasive surveillance. Joining Bart in conversation this evening is another very accomplished journalist who knows the intel world well, David Ignatius. David is both a prominent columnist for the Washington Post and the author of popular spy thrillers. His latest novel, The Paladin, just came out, and like his previous works, it's a great read with a very suspenseful plot grounded in a very plausible national security context. So Bart and David, the screen is yours.
So it's great for me to be here and to be able to host my former colleague, Bart Gellman. I've had the opportunity to read Bart's book. He asked me a few months ago if I'd look at it and said specifically that he wanted somebody who'd been concerned about the damage that Edward Snowden's revelations might have done to the United States to look at the book. I said in a blurb that's on the back, I hope, that whatever you think about Snowden, you'll find the revelations in this book of what the National Security Agency was doing as shocking as ever, as Bart puts the story together. This is also a book that's a marvelous tale of how journalism works. And Bart, I want to ask you to begin just by narrating the story of your initial encounters with the source that you initially referred to as Virax, how you began to learn about this source and what he was offering.
Well, my first encounters with Snowden, he came to me in the most unpromising way. As a guy who covers intelligence and writes spy novels, David, you must have this all the time. People come to you with grand conspiracies and plots and secret scandals that they want to reveal to you. And almost always, you could tell within a couple of lines that this is a nutcase or a zealot or just not someone who's going to be able to give you reliable information. Snowden's, we didn't know his name. We assumed that Virax, which is Latin for truth teller, was a man for some reason, portrayed himself as a member of the intelligence community who had a very, very big story that would describe overreach by the intelligence community against Americans and against the world. He talked about a surveillance machinery that had grown so large and powerful that it was a threat to democracy. And that was it. It was just talk about a document. And honestly, I was quite skeptical at the beginning. I was introduced to him, to Virax, by Laura Poitras, the filmmaker. He had approached Laura first, and she thought she could use some help. And I had covered surveillance and written a lot about it in my Cheney book. Well, over time, I gradually began interrogating Snowden or Virax. I asked him more and more detailed questions. I asked how he knew things, how he could purport to know them, whether the document was authentic, what marks of authenticity he could tell me, what would the government say would be the damage of disclosing his document, and so on. And we had dozens of hours of back and forth, many thousands of words. This was all done over anonymous, encrypted keyboard chats. Meanwhile, he was vetting me. He did not trust that a member of the mainstream media, someone working for the Washington Post, would have the guts to publish and would have the guts to stand up to government pressure to kill the story, which to me seemed bizarre. I mean, coming from the traditions of the Washington Post, which is the paper of Pentagon Papers and Watergate, and a lot more since, it seemed obvious to me that the paper would stand up for a valid story. It was not obvious to him.
So Bart, one of the fascinating moments is when you first bring this material, one document in particular, to Marty Baron, the Washington Post's executive editor. It's a very compelling scene, and maybe you could describe both your concerns about how you'd be received at the Post, and then the quite remarkable response both of Marty and of the paper's lawyers.
Sure. This was a very meaningful moment to me. I had left the Washington Post, as you said, or as Brad, I think, said in 2010. I came back with a proposal to rejoin as a contractor if they were interested in this story. And I first called the investigative editor, Jeff Lean, at home one night and said, Jeff, I have a very sensitive story. I need to meet with the editor, Marty Baron, whom I've never met because he was the new guy. It's a big story. I can't tell you anything about it, but I need you to get me a one-on-one meeting as soon as possible. And Jeff said, you got to be kidding. I mean, who does that? It was unreasonable on its face. And we went back and forth a little bit, and I told him I couldn't tell him anymore. And he actually hung up. He said no. And then he called me back about 10 minutes later and reconsidered. But he told me, this better be worth it. Please don't embarrass me. So I brought one document to Marty Baron. And I didn't tell them that there were more. There were 50,000 more. But I was still kind of freaked out about that and didn't know how it was going to go with the Post. And I said, there's an important story. It's about U.S. intelligence. There's a source I don't feel comfortable revealing to you yet because I had learned Snowden's name by then. If we work together, it's going to have to be different than I've ever worked at the Post on any kind of a story because the document is very highly classified and we actually have physical possession of it, which is unusual. I said, we'll need a safe, we'll need encrypted machines. Somebody here is going to have to learn how to use PGP encryption for email, learn how to chat live over anonymous proxies so that we can keep this document off any network. It can't ever be allowed to touch any machine that's connected to a network because people like the NSA can steal it. And we also don't want to show our hand to the government. And I had a long list of requirements, and it took me a long time to explain them. And the longer I talked, the more alarmed I became by the sound of my own voice. I thought that what I was saying was going to sound outrageous to Marty. And he just said, I'd like to see it. And I said, all right. And I opened up a throwaway computer and took out a thumb drive, and I showed him the document, and I walked him through it. I explained it. And he said, all right. And I said, he actually said, okay. That was his word. He's a laconic guy. He's one of the great editors I've ever worked for or even heard of. He is sparing with words. And he said, okay. And I needed to hear more. And he said, okay, we can work with your conditions. I want the story. So then I said, can I talk to you about one more thing? We were in a small group there, and I asked if I could step aside out of the room. Just Marty came out of the room with me, and the lawyer, Kevin Bain, from Arnold and Porter, the Washington Post longstanding law firm.
Covington and Burling, I think. Is it? Oh, is it
right? It's Covington.
It's not. It's Williams and Connolly. I want to make sure we get the.
You know what?
Williams and Connolly.
I can't believe. Of course, it was because Connolly was the first lawyer. I don't know how that came out wrong, but yes, Williams and Connolly. Kevin Bain, fantastic lawyer who I'd worked with over the years. So Kevin and Marty come into another room with me, and I say, there's one more thing. And I pull out a small hard drive from my pocket. And I say, it could be that there will be other stories. And I need to keep this safe. And I wonder if you'll keep this copy for me. And Kevin Bain, the lawyer, says, Marty, I can't advise you to do that. And Marty just looked at Kevin and looked at me, and he paused for one little beat, and then he said, I'm doing it. And I handed him that drive, and he took it, and I felt such immense relief that the Post was all the way in with me on this, that it was going to be willing to take risks to get this story out. And honestly, I had felt entirely alone up until that moment, through weeks and weeks of interaction with Snowden and the gradual realization that I had a bigger story that I knew how to handle. And having him sign up like that and put skin in the game meant everything.
So I think this is a good time to remind our viewers about the little green, kind of teal green button at the bottom of your screen, which you can push and you can order a copy of this extraordinary book. So Bart, the first story that is published is about an NSA program called Prism, which has some extraordinary names from the technology world associated with it. Just if people have forgotten just the nature of the surveillance that was going on, describe that first revelation briefly for folks.
Yeah, so the Prism document was a 43 or 46 page PowerPoint slide deck that described a program. This was what I showed Marty that day when I first described the story to him. And the cover page has the sigil of an eagle astride the globe with what looks like yarn or twine in its talons, but the twine is wrapped all around the world. And these are the internet cables. So the eagle has the internet, in its grasp. And the way it did that was that the US government, the NSA, had formed relationships under legal compulsion with each of the largest internet companies in the world that are based in the United States. So Google and Facebook and Yahoo and Microsoft, AOL. At the time, Skype was separate from Microsoft. At the time, YouTube was separate from Google. And it had made arrangements whereby an NSA analyst sitting in Fort Meade or anywhere else in the world could type in selectors, which is target identifiers, usually an email address, but it can be something else, and then receive back everything that, say, Google had on that target. So if the target had been Bart and my email address, they would have potentially years of documents, photographs, videos, recordings, email after email, attachments, confidential business documents, whatever it was. It was not targeted at Americans. It was targeted at foreigners. But the way the program was designed and the way the collection happened created a situation in which for every foreign target you acquired, you got a tenfold increase in essentially digital bystanders. So, and there were many Americans in that pile. So there were, as of late 2013, there were 114,000 active selectors in there. Now, that's a lot of targets for a system in which you can automatically obtain everything, gigabytes of data. And so there were 114,000 targets. That meant that there were something on the order of 1 million bystanders. And the way the system works is they can't fish for Bart with a hook and a line, but they can trawl with a net and sweep me into that, and then they get to keep it. And so while this was not targeted at Americans and didn't target Americans, and although they did their best to follow all the rules and regulations, the actual effect of the program was to sweep in a lot of American data.
So one of the remarkable things about this book is that in addition to reminding us how extraordinary the violations of privacy were in these programs at that time, Bart's also quite critical and direct in his discussion of Edward Snowden himself. And I want to begin talking about Edward Snowden by asking you about a request he made at the very beginning. He wanted you to publish his cryptographic signature, and you refused. And I want you just to explain first what that was and why you said no, that wasn't appropriate for you as a journalist.
Sure, that's a really interesting moment in my relationship with Snowden. I do want to declare myself up front that I believe he did more good than harm. And I believe he was motivated by a desire to do good. But that doesn't make him perfect or anything like that. The episode you're talking about is one of the most sort of tensest moments in our early relationship. Snowden wanted my first story to be about Prism, which we've just been talking about. He asked me to publish the Prism slide deck online along with a much smaller file called the cryptographic signature. That is a tiny little file that contains what looks like random text, and it uses math, sort of the mathematics of cryptography, to sign the original document. If you run a little operation on your computer and say, check this signature, it compares the signature and the document, and it will tell you this document was signed by Edward Snowden, or in this case, it was signed by Virax, and it has not changed since it was signed. It's a way of authenticating and creating a record. I didn't understand why he wanted to publish the signature. And when I finally did understand why, I became very alarmed. He finally explained to me that he wanted the signature there so that he could go, he was in Hong Kong, he could go around to foreign embassies in Hong Kong, present himself, ask for a political asylum, and then by showing the file that appeared on the Washington Post site and showing his signature, which matched the file, he could prove that he was my source. By possession of the signature and the way cryptography works, he could prove mathematically that he was my source. And he wanted to do that in order to ask for asylum. And so I'm suddenly in a position where I've granted anonymity to what is then a confidential source in order to obtain information to share with the public. He would like me to expose his identity privately to a foreign national in order for him to obtain asylum or to evade American law. That's a very different transaction that struck me as being not at all what a reporter should do. And there was one other thing, which is that the Prism document itself had a number of things in it that I thought were too sensitive to publish, that I thought would be too damaging to publish, that were gratuitous, that, for example, exposed actual ongoing surveillance operations that were fed by Prism, and that had I published them, the operations would have ceased. I didn't think I should publish those things, and so that also mooted the signature question, because if I changed the file, if I redacted the file, if I left some pages out, then the signature would not match anyway. Snowden was very upset because he had been counting on this as part of his escape plan. And I felt terrible because he was a confidential source who had given me something very valuable and was at risk and was asking for help. And in a situation like that, your natural human instinct is to want to help, but my professional obligation was otherwise.
So let me ask you about another person who was involved, along with Laura Poitras, who you mentioned before, in this reporting, and that was Glenn Greenwald. You note in this same period, after he'd made that unusual request to include the signature, that Glenn Greenwald called a report at the New York Times, basically being very critical of you, claiming to be aware of your very secret contacts with Snowden, your source. Just describe a little bit of your approach to journalism, which you just described, and Glenn's, and kind of how you came out of that interaction.
Well, we are different. Glenn is a pugilist. He's a commentator. He's an analyst. He's someone who has a point of view and a background as a trial lawyer and wants to prosecute his case. He is also fond of claiming a sort of unique position as the one principled guy in the room, the one who's willing to stand up for the truth. I got a call one day from Charlie Savage at the New York Times, who told me, after I wrote about this cryptographic signature issue, he told me that he'd got a call from Glenn Greenwald. Glenn said that he'd read all my emails with Snowden and that I was lying, that Snowden had never demanded that I publish the cryptographic signature. And so my reactions were in approximately this order. Wait a minute, the privacy crusader is reading all my email and telling you about it? That's point number one. Number two, he can't possibly have read all my email because Snowden doesn't keep it. And I didn't give it to him. Number three, Snowden did demand that I use the signature. I mean, I had all the transcripts of that. And four, it made no sense what Greenwald was saying. He was saying that Snowden just wanted me to publish the Prism document and not the signature, and that I could have edited the document. That's not the way signatures work. So I explained that technically to Charlie and said, you should just go ask an expert and you'll know. So Charlie never wrote the story. But I did have a bit of a turbulent relationship with Greenwald. We didn't actually have that much direct contact, but Greenwald had a lot to say about my coverage and about his coverage in public. And he fed a lot of media stories and started a lot of battles that I've never answered until now.
Again, one of the remarkable things about this book is how honest Bart is in telling the story behind the story. It's surely one of the biggest stories of the last couple decades, and it's rare to see a journalist be as self-critical and clear about the process. Let me again remind people the little teal button at the bottom of the screen, which is an important part of this exercise. And then, as you're buying Bart's book, I want to ask Bart to describe to us meeting Edward Snowden face to face in Moscow, and just to say a little bit about this extraordinary person. He changed the course of our story here in America and arguably the world's. What's he like? What was it like finally meeting him? And you ended up expressing some misgivings about some of what he did in the book, and maybe you could share that too.
Okay. since you mentioned the teal button, I want to mention one thing. One of the great losses of doing a virtual tour is that I don't get to meet readers and I don't get to sign copies. I'm going to post on my website, bartongellman.com, a way that you could get your copy signed. So keep that in the back of your mind. The first time I met Ed Snowden, he'd been very angry at me because of a story I published in the Post. It was a profile of him in which I inadvertently and foolishly exposed an online anonymous handle that he was using, which was Virax. I mean, until I published it, nobody knew that he was using an identity called Virax, and it just escaped me that he was using that as a handle, as one of his secret accounts, as opposed to just the word he called himself. So that caused him some trouble, and he was angry at me, and it took a long time before he sort of settled down. We didn't speak for a while. And I said, I'd like to be the first journalist to come see you in Moscow. And after many negotiations, he agreed. I expected by then, several months after his name became known, and after he got himself stranded in Moscow, which, as an aside, was not his intended destination. I expected to find a guy who could not really have imagined how isolated he would become, how much he would lose, how distant he would have become from his own society, from his own family. I wondered whether he would have regrets. I wondered whether, even if he didn't have regrets, he would be just sort of desolated. And I didn't find any of that. I found a guy who calls himself an indoor cat, who is, he tells me, nearly autistic in his ability to tune out the world and to focus on the screen in front of him. I asked him while I was there how many hours a day he thought he was online, and he said, all the hours that I'm awake. For him, living in Hawaii and living in Moscow were not as different as they might be for someone else. He socialized on the screen. He did his work on the screen. He entertained himself on the screen, and he could lead a very fulfilled life that way, especially once his then girlfriend, now wife, Lindsay Mills, was given permission to visit him and to stay with him in Moscow. He is a man who is absolutely certain of his righteousness, who believed in his bones that he was doing the right thing, and who had no regrets at all. He thought that what he said that what he wanted to do was to make information available so that the public could decide for itself what it thought of these programs, and that once I started publishing and Glenn and Laura started publishing their own stories, then his work was done. Mission accomplished, he said to me. That was an interview that drew quite a bit of ire from General Clapper, the head of the director of national intelligence, and others at the time. That they saw him as sort of smug and narcissistic. I didn't read him that way myself at all. He didn't actually think that he had some special handle on good and evil. He actually thought that the moral and ethical questions were obvious, and that there just weren't that many people who were willing to look at them in the face, who worked inside the system. People had their doubts, but buried them. And he believed that if no one else was going to act, then he had to. He didn't think he was smarter than everybody else. He just thought he was more willing to act on it.
So we have a bunch of questions from viewers, and I'm going to turn to them in another few minutes. But Bart, I want to ask you a couple more things before I turn you over to our viewers. First, I'm curious what you think Snowden will think when he reads this book. Maybe you already know. Maybe he's already seen a copy and you've heard his response. But I'd be very curious about that.
I'm really going to let Snowden speak for himself on this. He has seen the book. and he's given me his private reaction, but that's not for me to say in this case. That truly was in confidence. I think that he always expected me to be independent from him. He knew. He told me, and I write about this in the book, that he did not expect a sort of a defender in me. He expected someone who was deeply interested in the questions of surveillance and privacy and security, who had some background knowledge on the subject and could delve into them, and that he thought I would bring facts to light, even if I wouldn't always be as kind to him as he would like. And he said, I think he said to me directly, the quote is very close to this in the book. I didn't confide in you because I thought you'd have my back. I confided in you because I thought you would report.
Another question that I'm sure many of our viewers have, that I have, is whether you think if Snowden were to return to the United States, he should be prosecuted for what he did.
Good God, man! You can't ask a reporter to opine on the prosecution of his source. I would not like to see that happen. I believe, as I said, that he's done a lot more good than harm, and that he did it with the best of intent. I think that we would have much less of a picture as citizens of the boundary between the government and its constituents. We would have much less of an understanding of the boundary between intelligence and a free society, and the internet would be radically less secure today than it is, had it not been for Snowden. Because of Snowden, you have the giants of the internet, including Yahoo, which was reluctant, and Facebook and Microsoft and Google have begun to encrypt all their connections to your machine. Those communications between your machine and the internet at large were largely unencrypted in 2013, and today they're largely encrypted. Most websites you go to have a little lock icon at the top left of your screen, which stands for SSL, the Secure Sockets Layers. And that happened just flat out because of Snowden. If there were to be a trial of Snowden, I would like as a citizen to see that he had the ability to defend himself with a public interest defense. The problem right now is that we have no official Secrets Act in this country. That's not a problem. The problem is that because of that, when they want to prosecute someone for a leak, they use the espionage statute. And that's as much as to say as if you talk to a journalist and tell secrets out of school, you're a spy. You're the same as if you're a KGB agent, as the same as if you have turned traitor and gone to China and spilled secrets. And these are two very different transactions, right? I mean, if you're spying for China, you want to do it cloak and dagger in secret. You don't want anyone to find out. You want the US never to learn that it had been compromised. You want to harm your country. You want to benefit the foreign country. Compare that to talking to a journalist when you don't want it to be secret. You want to remain anonymous, but you want the journalist to tell the whole world what you found. You are most commonly a whistleblower who, whether you agree or not, thinks he or she is doing this for the public's benefit. It's just a completely different thing. The espionage statute is very simple. If you have lawful access to classified information, as Snowden did, if you have that clearance, and then you share classified information with anyone who's not authorized to receive it, then you're a spy. That's it. There is no defense. So, I mean, Snowden is by definition guilty of espionage as it's currently construed. And the Espionage Act is a mess of a statute from 103 years ago that probably would not withstand constitutional challenge in some circumstances. But that's what we got to work with. So he's not allowed to say, I did it, but I exposed unlawful programs. I did it, but the public benefited from this, and that was my intent. I did it, but my intent was not to harm my country. None of those defenses are available to him. He says that if he could put on a public interest defense, he would come back and face the charges. That's easy to say when there's no prospect of that happening. But if you take him at his word, he'd be prepared to face the music.
I must say, as somebody who, as I mentioned at the outset, has had some questions about Snowden and the consequences of his revelations, I found your book, Bart, absolutely convincing on the benefits, as you say, in terms of how the internet, our whole approach to privacy in this digital age was affected. So there's no question that there was a benefit, and I think that's widely accepted now. Let me close out my questions, and we've got some great questions that come from the audience by just asking one more thing about journalism. One of the extraordinary themes that runs through your narrative is the agonizing question that you faced about what among this vast trove of secret material should be published. And you're very clear that you don't approach this as a uninterested person. You're an American citizen. Harm to your country is something that you take seriously. If you could just say a word before we turn to the audience about how you went about making those judgments about what's fit to print, as we used to say, and what isn't.
So there's a lot going on here. That's a really rich question. First of all, I was most interested in policy boundaries. I was most interested in disclosing that the US government is doing things that we had no idea it was doing that affect us, or doing things that it said it wasn't doing, or doing things that went against all the tenor of what it had been saying without being literally lies. So just take one example. 2009, the government reported to Congress that it had only used Section 215 of the Patriot Act, which enables it to collect business records, 21 times in the course of the year. This had been a very controversial power. It was very much related to the NSA in this case. It was something that Congress had put a sunset on and demanded reports about. They said, don't worry, we're using it sparingly, only 21 times in the whole year. Well, from the Snowden documents, I discover that with 12 of those 21 orders, the NSA had obtained on the order of 1 trillion telephone records belonging to substantially every American. That records of the calls that everybody made to any number, whether it was local, foreign, or domestic, that is to say, who called whom and when and how long and so forth, had been collected by the NSA. So it may have only used it 21 times, but if your teenage daughter told you that she only invited 21 people to a party and didn't tell you that 1 trillion people showed up, you would probably feel you'd been misled. And so those are the kinds of stories I wanted to write. What I didn't want to write were stories that pointed to gaps in collection, things that we can't do that we're trying to do. I'm not a neutral. I'm not a citizen of the world. I am an American, and I have a rooting interest when there are questions of U.S. interest versus interests of sort of obvious adversaries. Let's just take, for example, Al-Qaeda. There were certain communications methods that were used by U.S. adversaries that the NSA could penetrate, and certain that it could not penetrate. And I had no interest at all in disclosing which were which, or talking about that. I have a hard time explaining things that I actually held back because I held them back, and I don't think they should be public. But I did come up with a sort of parable, a kind of fable that would help explain it, which is that suppose I had run across in the documents a presentation that showed that the NSA had planted mind-reading earrings on the mistress of the Emperor of Mars. And by use of these mind-reading earrings, it had discovered and helped ward off an invasion of the Earth. So first of all, you say, wow, that is a really big story. That's a big deal. And if a reader read it, the reader would say, well, this is huge. And then it would probably say, I didn't know they could do that. Then it would probably say, now you've told everyone they can do that, and now they can't do it anymore, you son of a bitch. And, look out for Venus when the next invasion plan comes along. And so I recognized that there were exciting, interesting stories, some valid stories even, that I couldn't write because of this. And let's say in that hypothetical, I would not write the story of the Emperor of Mars, but I would be looking for a way to write about mind-reading technology, because that's a very big and dangerous thing for the government to acquire. And I would want to look for ways to bring that to the public attention without blowing actual operations.
Great answer, characteristic of the author and of the tone throughout the book. I'm going to go now to your questions. And Bart, people realize correctly that you're a man who understands security and takes it pretty seriously and knows, what apps are really encrypted and which ones may not be so encrypted. So we have a question from Damon and from Joe. It's the same question. It's basically, is the encrypted communications app Signal, widely used, as safe as it claims to be?
Yes, it is. If the question had been what should I use to secure my own communications, it would have been Signal, signal.org. The code is all open source. It's been very well reviewed by some of the greatest cryptographic experts in the world, who greatly admire it. If you go to their website, they explain very clearly what they can and can't promise. What they can promise is that the contents of your communication are not going to be crackable in transit by any means known today. They also warn you about things like, if someone takes the other guy's device and opens it up and reads your messages, they're going to be in the clear. They're going to be decrypted. They say, we don't have the encryption key. Even under compulsion of a warrant, we could not decrypt your messages. We also don't know who you're talking to. We've designed our servers in such a way that all they tell us is when is the first time and when is the last time that your device connected with us. It's very good for what it does. It's also very simple and easy. And if I had it 7 years ago, I would have been very happy, because most of the time the software, which is getting better and better, is still relatively hard to use for encryption and anonymity.
So our viewers are allowed to vote on which questions they think are the most urgent. And the winner is the following. Has Mr. Gellman, I think you sort of answered part of this, but not all of it. Has Mr. Gellman been in contact with Edward Snowden recently? If so, how's he doing?
I have, and he is he's coming off the publication of his own memoirs, which were a success and a great secret. This is something I haven't ever seen happen in the publishing world. He not only embargoed his books so that you didn't see advanced reviews, but no one outside a very small number of people at his publishing house even knew that it was in the pipeline until weeks before it came out. That's a pretty tough secret to keep. And they did it for a number of reasons, including that the United States government went to court right away and moved to take all his profits from the book. But he'd already been paid the advance, and I assume they didn't get to that. He's married now. He's living with a woman he loves. He is employed by the Freedom of the Press Foundation. He gives paid lectures. He is interacting with technologists and lawyers and policymakers all the time about how to advance the causes that he cares about. He's living, I would say, a pretty full and fulfilling life that is in many ways very little different from what it would be if he were living in New York or Washington.
I'm going to remind people one more time about that little green button, because I don't want anybody to forget. That's the way you can order Bart's book. Here's a question about how you went about your reporting. The question is, when you started cultivating Snowden as a source, were you reaching out to other sources at NSA to find out about the extent of NSA's prior actions before Snowden, in effect, defected? In other words, did you have any idea that this activity existed?
Some of what Snowden revealed confirmed and elaborated on disclosures that had been made in 2000. No, I'm going to get this confused. 2004 and 2005 about warrantless domestic surveillance. One of 4 programs that Snowden disclosed was disclosed first by the New York Times after the 2004 election. It was a version of the story about the call records database that I've mentioned here. And I had done some reporting, quite a lot of reporting about that, and about the fact that it was conceived and devised by Vice President Cheney, that his chief of staff kept the operational papers in a safe in his own office, that Cheney and this chief of staff, or this general counsel Addington, kept this program secret from other people. I knew a lot of things like that. I didn't understand exactly how the program worked, and had actually broken my sword on that when I was writing the Cheney book. That when I wrote Angler, I just couldn't figure out exactly what is this program doing, where, how, and so on. And so when I saw that document that opened up those answers to me in the form of a long Inspector General's report that was classified, top secret, no foreign comment, SI ///, then it was a very gratifying moment. It's that moment when you, as a reporter, have spent a lot of energy on one thing, and finally the answers all come clear. But yes, I before, during, and after the time I was working with the Snowden materials, I was working with my own sources in and out of the U.S. government to try to find out context and to authenticate what he was telling me.
We have several questions here that are a bit more critical of Snowden. Let me read a couple of them. Snowden took and disclosed so much more than necessary to reveal NSA's collection against Americans that I've never accepted his efforts to justify what he did. How does he explain taking and revealing information that aided U.S. adversaries, including Russia?
I'm really glad someone asked that because it's an important issue. It's a valid question. And I think that the subject is pretty widely misunderstood. There are a lot of U.S. government officials and critics of Snowden who would say, yes, maybe there were American privacy issues involved in some of the disclosures, like the call records program, like Prism, where Americans are involved. But most of what he disclosed, my dog wants you to know, most of what he disclosed had to do with foreign operations, operations conducted overseas that had nothing to do with American privacy. And that's where they're wrong, because overseas isn't overseas the way it used to be, because the internet And global telecommunications links don't follow national boundaries or geographic boundaries, which means that if I am standing next to you, David, and I send a message from my phone to your phone, and we're in the same room, there is a near certainty that that message is going to cross into Singapore or Bogota, because let's again use Google as the dominant player in this. Google and its counterparts have data centers, massive factory-like, castle-like data centers all around the world. And they function in a kind of tandem to balance the load on this sort of stupendous transfer of data back and forth to devices and around different accounts. And they also have globally dispersed backups. So my message might actually pass through some foreign place before it reaches your phone, because on the internet, packets divide up and work that way. But if it doesn't, it's going to end up in a backup overseas. And so if the NSA conducts an operation, as it did, as I revealed, that is breaking into the Google Cloud, that is tapping into the private fiber optic cables, thousands of miles of cables that Google uses to connect its data centers from one country to another. If the NSA is breaking into Google overseas like that, it is allowed to assume, for legal purposes, that the people it's collecting are foreigners. If it happens overseas, you're allowed to presume a foreign communicant. That has nothing to do with what's actually happening, which is that tens or even hundreds of millions of American accounts are stored over there. And you're going to incidentally, as the legal term goes, incidentally, which does not mean accidentally, which does not mean inadvertently, or it doesn't mean unforeseeably. Incidental just means you were aiming for a foreigner and you happen to sweep in these extra 10 million Americans. They're allowed to do that, and they're allowed to keep it. And under some circumstances, they're allowed to share it. And they have rules for minimizing or masking, which are very much in the news today, but they're conditional rules. And bottom line is that for some of the incidentally acquired content, which is an enormous amount, American privacy is very much on the block. And so all these people who are saying Snowden revealed only primarily overseas operations are missing this fundamental point. There were case after case like that. The location information that was being sucked up overseas, content, address books. There were a whole series of stories that were very hard to get and very hard to figure out that I worked on with my partner Ashkan Soltani in the Washington Post, and that I talk about in greater detail in the book.
And Bart, just to kind of fact check here on the current situation, does the NSA still have the legal authority to go into these foreign data centers in pursuit of its mission? In other words, is this kind of activity that you described in the book continuing in your judgment?
So as a fact-based reporter who cares about evidence, I have to start off by saying I don't know if they're still doing it. My knowledge is dated. But the interesting thing about the legal authority is there was never any congressional or judicial authority for the NSA to do this. For intelligence operations overseas, as you know, they're based fundamentally on presidential authority in the form of Executive Order 12333, which lays out the foundational guidance for intelligence collection overseas. And if you're breaking into Google off the coast of Ireland, that does not require congressional authority. It doesn't require closed hearings in the intelligence committees. It doesn't require FISA judges, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court judges, to know about it or to authorize it. It's done entirely on presidential authority. And again, the premise of all this, which was true until a few decades ago, maybe even less than a few decades ago, was that if you go overseas and you open up your spy gadget, you're gonna collect on foreigners. That's no longer the case, and the rules need to be adapted for that.
So we're going to close out this session, turn this back to Brad Graham, our host, but I want to ask just one question. Several of our viewers have asked it in different ways, but it basically is about Russia and Snowden's residence there. One questioner puts it this way: how can Snowden promote freedom of the press while living in a country which suppresses such freedoms?
He's well aware of the irony, and all I can say is that he is genuinely not in Russia by choice. I saw his air ticket. His ticket was from Hong Kong to Ecuador by way of Russia and Havana. That's the route that you could fly. The State Department canceled his passport. While he was en route, he was no longer able to board an international flight. He spent 39 days at the Moscow airport with no papers, and eventually got granted asylum in Russia. He is not, he's not taking money from Russia. There is lots of surmise, but no evidence that he is giving secrets to Russia or working for Russia or ever worked for Russia. And I guarantee you, I looked hard for that. If I could have found out that Snowden was actually a Russian agent, that would have been the scoop of the book. It would have been huge. I would have been highly incentivized to write it. I would be very interested in writing it if it were true. And as best I can tell, and I tried really hard, there's no evidence for that. He is living there because if he leaves, he'll be clapped in irons, and because he got stuck there in the first place by a bureaucratic error on the American government side.
So we've come nearly to the end of our hour, and I just want to invite our host, Brad Graham, back. And before I leave, just personally thank Bart. This is an extraordinary book, and I hope people will buy it and read it.
Can I just say that I really loved your most recent book, The Paladin, which I know you've already come to Politics and Prose to talk about. But for those interested in Snowden, Snowden is an interesting character off screen or off the page in David's book. He's talked about a lot, and there are a couple of characters who bear a certain resemblance to Snowden in the book, and I wish we could have had time to talk about that too.
Bart and David, thanks so much for really a truly fascinating and informative discussion. You know, normally at this point, I would once again direct viewers to push the green purchase button below. But David, you did such a great job at that. You know, you're evidently a natural retailer. So I'll just thank everyone again for tuning in, and from all of us at Politics and Prose, stay well and well read.